of the Bob Graham Center for Public Service. My name is Dr. Teresa Cornacchione, and I'm the Civic Engagement Coordinator here at the center. I'm pleased to welcome you all to this very special program this evening, where we will get to meet author Ray Arsenault and hear about his new book, John Lewis, In Search of the Beloved Community. We invite you to stay after tonight's program and enjoy a reception and the opportunity to purchase this wonderful book. On behalf of the Graham Center, I would like to thank Dr. Jack Davis, Distinguished Professor of History, and the Rothman Family Chair in the Humanities for co-sponsoring this evening's talk. This evening's discussion of Dr. Arsenault's biography of John Lewis is particularly timely. As we approach the 60th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act, it is essential that we reflect upon the sacrifices, the struggles, and the enduring purpose of the civil rights activists, including the late Senator Lewis. His and others' efforts were crucial in expanding the franchise and ensuring that Americans can participate fully in our great democracy. Also, the spirits of those efforts embodies the founding principles of the Bob Graham Center for Public Service and honors the legacy of the late Senator Graham. He believed that democracy was not a spectator sport, and that it is essential that citizens be equipped with the tools for active participation. Both he and Senator Lewis dedicated their lives to empowering others to fully engage in public service. When John Lewis came to this campus in 2015, he appeared with Senator Graham to discuss the legacy of the Voting Rights Act and the importance of active participation, encouraging young people to connect, share, and engage. On the eve of yet another presidential election, I can think of no better topic than the legacy of the late Senator John Lewis, and I can think of no better venue than the Graham Center. I hope we leave this evening inspired to take an active part in our democracy. Thank you for coming. I would now like to introduce Dr. Jackie Davis, Distinguished Professor of History and the Rothman Family Chair for Humanities. Jack?
Thanks, everybody, for coming out. We're excited about tonight's program. I want to introduce our two speakers, or the two folks here on the stage who are, and we'll have a conversation about Ray's book. On my immediate left is Paige Glosser, who is an associate professor of history here at the University of Florida. She joined our department this fall, and we're really pleased to have her. We lured her away from the University of Wisconsin, where she held a professorship at Wisconsin, and came down to Florida and hurricane country. She is the author of a book titled How the Suburbs Were Segregated, Developers and the Business of Exclusionary Housing, 1890 to 1960, a book that has won 2 prestigious awards, but also inspired the development of a digital project of which she is the founder, author, and developer of. She is now working on a new book using the working title Transnational Peripheries, Remaking, I can't read my own writing, remaking what? Suburbs, thank you. Suburbs in the U.S. and Latin America. When she was here for her job interview, she gave us a sneak peek of her work, her new work, and it sounds very exciting. And then on my far left, the only other person left on stage is Ray Arsenault. And Ray, I added up the numbers today, and you and I have known each other 35 years, which is really remarkable. Ray was really the reason why I went to graduate school, and I truly owe him my career. He's been a mentor for me throughout my career. He got me through my MA program and sent me off to a nice PhD program, and has been a friend ever since, a very, very good friend, and a model for anybody who's interested in writing and scholarship. His list of books is quite long. I'll just read a few of them. Of course, you know about the book tonight, John Lewis, In Search of the Beloved Community, which came out earlier this year. Before that, he published a a wonderful biography of Arthur Ashe titled Arthur Ashe, A Life. And before that, a book titled The Sound of Freedom, Marian Anderson. And I can't read my writing again, but I'll just tell you the book is about Marian Anderson and her performance in Washington, D.C., which was really a pivotal moment in the modern civil rights movement. Before that, and by the way, the Marian Anderson book was the inspiration for a PBS documentary. And the book before that was also an inspiration for a PBS documentary, and that was Freedom Riders, 1961 and the struggle for racial justice. It was, again, it inspired a PBS documentary that won 3 Emmy Awards and a Peabody. Ray, in addition to being a wonderful teacher and scholar, has won a number of teaching awards. He's now emeritus and painting. He's taken up painting, but he's still writing. And he's still very much involved in human rights and civil liberties issues, for which he has won numerous awards. So welcome our 2 speakers, and thanks again for coming out.
To get us started, it's really just a pleasure to be able to talk to you tonight. And I think even before we start talking about In Search of the Beloved Community, I was curious about what brought you to the history of civil rights, of which you just have a long publication record, as Jack mentioned.
That's an interesting question. Probably it's buried in my autobiography, in a sense that I was a kid from Cape Cod, pretty Yankee background, but my father was a naval officer, and we were moving every 2 years, mostly in the South. And he was a photographer and would go on board aircraft carriers, and he'd be gone for 2-3 years when I was a small boy. And so I was either living in a kind of cradle-to-grave segregated Jim Crow society somewhere in the South Virginia, Florida, or I was on the Cape Cod, where the town where I was born, Harwich, is well known for cranberries. And it has the largest non-white population in that part of Massachusetts. About 35% of the population were brought over to work either in the whaling industry or in cranberries. And they call themselves Portuguese. They're actually Cape Verdean mixed race people. I'm sure it was not perfect by any means, but they were well integrated into the community. They were teachers and policemen and firemen and you name it. And I had a lot of friends from that community, and it was natural. Kind of racial integration was natural there. So the contrast between the two, I think, was extraordinary. So very early on, I kind of fixated on trying to figure out who I was, I guess, but also about regional culture and race. And moving back and forth, and finally moved back to Florida the day of the March on Washington, 1963. A pretty incredible time, and then just before John Kennedy's assassination, and spent my last 2 years in high school on Amelia Island in North Florida, which was, in racial terms, a very traditional Southern town. And I was a 15-year-old kid, interested in the normal things and trying to survive, and I clearly was at odds with most of the people in my high school class, and except for a woman who became my wife. We were the only 2 kind of vocal integrationists in our high school class, and we're still together, so it may tell you something about and just another word, when I went to Princeton, I was incredibly fortunate to become a research assistant for Sheldon Hackney, who was a young historian, just gotten his PhD at Yale. He was from Birmingham. He had sort of married into civil rights royalty. His father-in-law, Clifford Durr, was Rosa Parks' attorney. He was the one who got her out of jail in the beginning of the Montgomery bus boycott. And his mother-in-law, Virginia Durr, was a kind of legendary figure in the voting rights movement. She almost personally, she was a good friend of Eleanor Roosevelt's, personally led the anti-poll tax campaign. So becoming his research assistant at the age of 19 changed my life forever. I was thrown into a world of white and black activists that I scarcely knew existed before. And Sheldon was an incredible role model. And so that's how got me into this really fascination with civil rights and race.
And now flash forward, right, several decades, and you had the pleasure of actually getting to know John Lewis, right? Can you talk a little more about that as well as the origins of this project?
Yeah. John became a good friend. I met him in 2000 when I was just beginning the book on the Freedom Rides. And of course, he was one of the original 13 Freedom Riders, 7 blacks and 6 whites. And he was in Congress, of course, at that point, and he was organizing reunions. So he was organizing the 40th reunion. So I walked in just as an interview for my book. He was the first person I interviewed, actually, for the book, and which took me 8 years to write. And he was looking for lost Freedom Riders. And of course, I'd spent a year looking up phone numbers and tracking them down and calling them. And so I was quite a resource for him. And we sort of put our heads together, and he kind of made me an honorary Freedom Rider, you might say. And he invited me to the reunion, and I was on the bus with them doing interviews, and he was just so gracious, so warm. I don't know that I've ever met anybody like him, really. I was very nervous that first meeting in his office in Washington, and I made the mistake of calling him Congressman Lewis. And he goes, "Get that out of here, I'm John," to everybody. And he really meant it. I mean, it was not false modesty. He never seemed to have really any ego about him, no sense of pretense. He was just genuine, and we really became friends. And I would see him quite a bit over the next 20 years. Never enough. I must say, he was the one person, or at least one of the people, who could make me feel really guilty. I felt like I was never doing enough for social justice and civil rights when I was. He didn't try to make me feel guilty, but I just couldn't imagine living up to his standards. And then in 2011, we were on Oprah together in the 50th anniversary of the Freedom Rides, and that was a thrill I never expected to have in my career, I must say. And because she had seen a DVD of the film Freedom Riders, which the great documentary filmmaker Stanley Nelson had done. I worked with him for 3 years on the film, and they sent her a DVD copy. She calls Stanley within 15 minutes, sobbing into the phone, you know, that she said, "I didn't know. I just didn't know this story." And I think she felt bad in part because her father is a barber in Nashville, and a number of his clients were former Freedom Riders. So she had an obvious hook into the story, but she just never somehow gotten it. And so she's sobbing on the phone that I feel so embarrassed. And she was ending her show then. She only had 4 shows left. She said, I've got to devote one of them to the Freedom Rides. So sure enough, she flew in at her expense 180 Freedom Riders and their families for 5 days in Chicago, and filled the Harpo studio, and it was an amazing scene, really. And it took her 3 or 4 times to do the introduction. She'd just start crying. She'd lose it, and she'd start again. And being in the presence of these incredible heroes of hers, and so when I talked to the producers before we went on the show, and they said, "Have you got? This is Oprah, after all. Have you got a reconciliation story? Have you got a Reformed Klansman for us that we can bring on?" And I said, "Well, as a matter of fact, I do. There's a man named Elwyn Wilson who lives in Rock Hill, South Carolina, and back in 1961, the original Freedom Ride, it was the first act of violence against the Freedom Riders in Rock Hill. They left Washington a week before, and John was beaten pretty badly. That was the first of his severe beatings. Ultimately, he had 45 beatings and 45 incarcerations and arrests. So he survived it, but that was the first time when he had the bandages on his head. You see all the photographs, he always has bandages on his head. And even today, now that, well, not today because he's gone, unfortunately, but later in life, he had lost all his hair, and you could see all the marks from various beatings all over his skull. But anyway, so I told them about Mr. Wilson, and they said, well, that's perfect. And so we brought on Mr. Wilson. And because he had left the Klan. He grew up, he found religion, he got married, had children, left the Klan, always felt terrible about what he had done to John Lewis back in 1961. He always wanted to apologize. And then in 2009, the first Obama inauguration, there's John Lewis sitting big as life right behind Obama when he was swearing in. And so he took sort of a gamble. The next day he called John's office and was amazed that he actually got John. Doesn't happen to very many congressmen. And he's sobbing into the phone and saying, I'm so sorry, can you please forgive me for what I did to you? I've always felt terrible about it. And of course, John Lewis is all about forgiveness. And not only did he forgive him, they were crying and praying and all this sort of thing. And I think with most people that would have been the end of it, but not with John Lewis. He invited him up, flew him up to Washington to have a kind of come to Jesus meeting in his office. And again, they're praying and crying, and they became friends. Simple as that. And so we brought Mr. Wilson on. Now he's in his 70s and pretty frail, and he's surrounded by 180 freedom riders who at one time were his enemy, right? And he's incredibly nervous. So Oprah could only have 2 people at a time on camera. The others were all around. So I'm sitting next to John, and Mr. Wilson's on the other side. So I had a ringside seat for what was going on. So Oprah asks her first question. Silence. He just had a look of terror in his eyes. So she gulped and tried again. Asked him another question. Again, not only was it silence, it looked like he was just going to get up and bolt the stage. He was just terrified. It was amazing. John reaches over with his left hand, grabs Mr. Wilson's right hand and says, in a voice that was so loud everybody could hear it, he says, "He's my brother." It was such an act of compassion and generosity and forgiveness. I mean, I don't know if I've ever any witnessed it was a simple gesture, but and it calmed him down enough that he could get through it. And he died about 1.5 years, 2 years later, but he had his day in a sense. And for me, that will always be the quintessential John Lewis. I mean, that was the moment. In fact, that is the moment. I mean, I'd already interviewed him many times and wrote a lot about him in Freedom Riders, but that's the moment I know I have to write his biography. I've got to do this book if it kills me.
And was he aware that you were going to write the book?
Well, not until just I saw him. He came to St. Petersburg, and I told him, but it wasn't too long after that he found out he had pancreatic cancer, and he only had 6 months to live, and I just couldn't bring myself to bother him. I'd already talked to him hours and hours, and there was nothing more really I could extract from him. But so I depended on his roommate in college, Bernard Lafayette, who's a major civil rights figure in his own right, who's from Tampa, from Ybor City, and Bernard had become a real close friend of mine, and so he sort of filled in any gaps that there were, because he was probably John's closest friend in the world. Bernard's still going strong at 84, I must say. He's still one of the most sought after nonviolent trainers in the world. He was known as Little Gandhi during the movement. And so anyway, I was very, very grateful to Bernard, and I dedicated the book to him.
I do think that, one thing that struck me when reading the book is just the steadfast commitment of Lewis to nonviolence, to racial reconciliation, and also to some extent to forgiveness. And Yet he never seemed to verge on irrelevance. He never seemed out of step with the times, with changing politics, with changing movements. I wonder how you would sort of explain this. How did John Lewis always manage to always seem so in touch and yet so committed to these long-held beliefs?
Well, I think it was difficult, very difficult, even for him. In some ways, it's a great irony that he became the major civil rights leader who became a politician, because he was very skeptical in his early years. He was a leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, became the chair for 3 years before he was displaced by Stokely Carmichael. And earlier, in 1961, the Kennedy administration was terrified of nonviolent direct action, that it was going to create this conflagration in the South. So they went through Harry Belafonte to offer foundation funds to these radical SNCC kids, including John, if they would sort of tone down the direct action and focus on voting rights. And of course, John and the others knew exactly what was going on. They were being bribed, essentially, for this. They had no money, and now they have money. And they were interested in voting rights, but they were more interested in the larger picture of desegregating society and bringing an end to Jim Crow. So John was one of the ones who didn't want to take the money at first. Finally, actually, it was Bernard Lafayette who sort of found a compromise. He said they created 2 wings, a voting rights wing and a nonviolent direct action wing of SNCC. And Bernard said, even a bird needs 2 wings to fly, kind of thing. That was the joke within SNCC. But John was not part of that voting rights section. He wanted to be out in the streets. He didn't want anybody's, even though he was a gentle demeanor, he had fire in his belly. I mean, he was just absolutely committed to action more than words. In fact, he once said, when he was running against Julian Bond for Congress, his good friend in 1986, it was a terrible thing for their friendship, but he said, unlike Julian, I'm a tugboat, not a showboat. I'm a tugboat, not a showboat. And that it's a great irony that he became probably American history's leading voting rights advocate. That became his sort of calling card, and spent much of his life fighting for it, and made the transition. You know, in 1965, Bayard Rustin, who was the great Gandhian intellectual, wrote a wonderful article, but very controversial, from protest to politics. And he was saying, okay, I mean, I organized the March on Washington. He was the primary organizer along with A. Philip Randolph. But it's time that we started running for office. We started fighting from the inside, not just on the outside. So, of course, eventually Jesse Jackson ran for president, and you had a number of doing it. But John becomes the primary example of someone making the transition from someone who is getting arrested in the streets for standing up for what he believes in, and a practicing politician. Now, of course, the 2 halves of his life, it's not quite a dichotomy, because he actually was arrested for nonviolent direct action 5 times as a congressman. He was always getting arrested in front of the South African embassy, protesting apartheid, or the Darfur, the Sudanese embassy for trying to defend people in Darfur, and on and on and on. But he somehow was able to keep his longer view, kind of eyes on the prize, notion that he was searching for the beloved community. And he never wavered on that, but he had to do a lot of practical politics as well. And I think people were skeptical that he could do it, that he would just be a civil rights leader in Congress. And he continued to do that, but he got a lot of legislation done as well. So he was very effective, served 17 terms. Many of those elections he wasn't even opposed. The Republicans finally gave up. They said, we can't beat this guy. So he really mastered the political art. I don't think it was ever easy for him, because he didn't, about the important things, he didn't really want to compromise.
And he also often seemed dissatisfied with leaders, with presidents. I mean, you write in the book about his kind of complicated thoughts on Lyndon Johnson, on Jimmy Carter, on Bill Clinton. Can you talk a little bit about how he actually maintained and cultivated political relationships?
Well, he didn't do very much of it in terms of personal contact. The person he knew best actually was Bobby Kennedy, and he worked for him in the '68 campaign. He was there when he was assassinated, and he had a particularly troubling relationship with John Kennedy. At the March on Washington, John gave the most radical speech by far. He cut out some of it because A. Philip Randolph and Martin Luther King asked him to, but he still talked about we're going to create a nonviolent army and we're going to march through the South just like Sherman marched through Georgia, you know, kind of a scorched earth campaign. And a lot of the organizers didn't like that at all, and were worried that they were going to turn off a lot of people. And Kennedy didn't like it either, and so they were all invited. He was one of the big six. He was only 23 years old. The rest of them were twice his age. This young kid, so they bring him to the White House after the March on Washington, and Kennedy would hardly talk to him, wouldn't shake his hand, you know, and John Kennedy later said, those SNCC kids, they're just son of a bitches. You know, he really didn't like John at all because he gave such a tough speech. I mean, the Kennedy administration wanted the March on Washington to be a kind of showcase for the Civil Rights Act that was being considered, and which was not a bad thing. But the March on Washington was the march for jobs and freedom, and John took that literally. He didn't just want a Civil Rights Act that dealt with public accommodations. He wanted to change the fundamental structure of the American economy, and as it deals with race. And of course, Lyndon Johnson, I mean, I think he came to grudgingly respect Johnson, and particularly the speech, some of the great speeches that he made, but never really, I think, trusted him. And the same was true with Jimmy Carter. Of course, John's in Georgia, and he knows what Carter was like before the presidential campaign, when he was kind of not a closet segregationist, he was a segregationist. And he changed publicly, but John just didn't trust him, even though he worked in his administration, helped run the Action Agency, which was overseed the Peace Corps and Vista and things like that. And then Bill Clinton, suffice to say, he didn't like any of the Republican presidents, but he liked Bill Clinton, but he got very disillusioned in the second term. As many of you know, Clinton almost had to turn himself into a Republican to get reelected, and John felt that he was really missing a great opportunity to strike a blow for democracy. He actually was much more positive towards Hillary, which made it difficult, very difficult for him, because he was personally friendly with her. And then when Obama emerged in 2007, 2008, and John knew his endorsement would count a lot, and he finally he said, I have to go with Obama. This is something that may change the course of American history, and we've never seen anything like this. And Hillary understood, actually. They remained friends, even though it may have actually cost her the nomination. That's how influential he was with the black vote.
There was one small passage from the book speaking of, say, activism and organizing within black communities, and that stuck out to me. And it was when Lewis commissioned a poster as part of the head of the voter education project. It was a Coffee Bailey's poster that said, "Hands that pick cotton now can pick our elected officials." And he talked about, and you quote him, how he was pleased to see that it wound up on the walls of beauty parlors, barbershops, schools, and churches throughout the South. So it seems like Lewis always maintained a very keen eye to kind of the importance of community in terms of politics, and whether that was formal electoral change or even just kind of expanding the possibilities for change in all dimensions. Can you kind of, I guess, speak to what community meant for Lewis, especially in terms of his politics and organizing?
Well, every year, they have a commemoration of Bloody Sunday when he was beaten on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And it's quite a moving thing. There's an organization called Faith in Politics, which I was lucky enough, I was the keynote speaker this year there. And, but they always have what they call the Foot Soldiers Luncheon. And it's a whole afternoon with the people who are often forgotten in the Selma story. In fact, when I saw the movie Selma, some of you may probably have seen that, I was really disappointed. Even though it was a fine piece of filmmaking, but it got the story, to my view, all wrong, because it really emphasized these kind of charismatic leaders who were leading people, and when in fact I think it was the inner strength of those individual, mostly African Americans in Selma, who risked their lives, the foot soldiers. And John always thought of himself as a foot soldier. He never really wanted to be a leader in the movement. It was sort of thrust upon him to be the head of SNCC, and he always felt more comfortable, really, with a mass of people, and he more than sympathized with them. I mean, I think he really thought he was one of them. He had incredibly modest origins, extraordinary poverty in Pike County. He was one of 10 children. His family had nothing, no running water, no electricity, no paved roads, and that was his world, really, until he was a teenager. And so he came from sort of another place, So the trajectory of his life, I think, is quite extraordinary. His chief of staff the last few years was a guy named Michael Collins, who after John died worked for Kamala Harris in the White House. And Michael told me, he said, wherever he went in the world, he took Pike County with him, which was interesting to me because for a while he was sort of alienated from his family because he put them in jeopardy. They could never understand why he was so passionate about it, that he couldn't, it was no choice for him. He had to march, he had to protest, he had to do anything he could to fight social injustice. And I think they were proud of him ultimately. I know they are now, but for a while they thought, well, first of all, he was going to be a preacher. But early on he decided that the preachers that he had contact with were not interested in the social gospel at all. In fact, he heard a radio sermon by Dr. King in 1956 during the Montgomery bus boycott. And that changed his life. He never heard anything about the social gospel, that actually religion could help people down on earth, not just get them to heaven. And he devoted the rest of his life to it. And so in that sense, I think he knew there was an inner strength to people, many of whom were among the poorest people in the nation, really had no reason to think that they could actually upset the apple cart, so to speak. They had no financial resources, they had no powerful friends, but they just had the strength inside them, and he was sort of the quintessential representative of what some people call movement culture. I mean, the movement became his family. And he kept connections to his family for sure, and he would go back and he loved his family. And his brothers today, I've met a lot of his brothers. They're just they often cry when they talk about him, But none of them took that road, he as he said, the movement became my family, and the notion of a movement culture where you're wrapped up in something that is bigger than you are, that transcends everything, really. That was the secret weapon of the civil rights movement. There have been a number of books written, very fine books, about this whole notion of the movement culture, and I've tried to bring it out in my own work. That during the Freedom Rides, for example, all the Freedom Riders were put in Parchman Prison, probably the scariest place you could be put. And both the Kennedy administration and the segregationist politicians in Mississippi thought that would be the end of the Freedom Rides. When they got into a real prison, they'd go screaming back to their mothers and fathers. Exactly the opposite happened. Because they were sort of trained in Gandhian philosophy, and one of the most important parts of Gandhian philosophy is the notion of unmerited suffering. That's sort of the way to a higher consciousness. So the Mississippi prison system gave them unmerited suffering, and they turned Parchman Prison into a kind of a university of nonviolence. More than 300 of them in there, and it was really, when I was writing about this, I talked to John about it once. I said, I almost felt sorry for the white racists in Mississippi because they didn't know what they were up against. They thought they could use the standard techniques of intimidation and these kids would crack. And I knew full well, these were kids who made out their last will and testament before they got on those buses. 19-year-old kids who didn't expect to come back. And they're going up against their parents and their religious leaders and their teachers who said, you're going to prove nothing. You're just going to get yourself killed. You're not going to prove that the Deep South is ready for nonviolent direct action. You're going to prove it's not ready, and you're going to set the movement back. And they said, well, if they kill us, others will come. We cannot let violence stamp out nonviolence. And they believed that so firmly they were willing to die for it. And I think once you cross that line, there's almost nothing you can't do.
Yeah, I think I have one more question. I think then we'll start turning it over to the audience. But it's this: what lessons do you want your readers to take from this book?
Well, I think I hope they get a few lessons out of the book. I didn't really write it in that sense. Although it's difficult in writing civil rights history, there's really no place for objectivity. We just have that notion that you got to be objective. I think long ago we decided you just have to be honest with your audience. You have to tell them who you are, where you come from, and they can make the decision, the extent to which you're biased or your bias is hurting your analysis. But in the case of this book, I've had it before. Arthur Ashe was another extraordinary figure. So was Marian Anderson. I chose these kinds of figures in part because early in my career, I wrote about Southern demagogues. My first book was called The Wild Ass of the Ozarks, which Bill Clinton used to have in Air Force One. And initially, before he read the book, he thought he was the wild ass of the Ozarks, but it wasn't about him. It was an earlier politician who was kind of a redneck hero. But at some point, I decided I don't want to spend my whole life, my whole career, fascinating as these figures are, writing about them, about sort of if I can say, the bad guys. I had a lot of connection to the civil rights movement myself, and I just wanted to recover these stories because I think they're so empowering. I remember being in Selma at the foot soldiers banquet and just thinking, wow, if I can have just even a fraction of their courage, the moral and physical courage to do what they did, and you can't help but be moved. I've been so struck. I've been lecturing all over the country about this and to some very large audiences, and I've had so many people come up to me afterwards with tears in their eyes. It wasn't because of me, it was because of John Lewis, that they would keep asking me, is there another John Lewis? And they kind of looked expectantly like I had an answer to that, I said, well, I really like Bryan Stevenson, the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, but I don't know that you're going to find another John Lewis. It has the whole complex. But I guess it's the notion of empowerment, of standing up for what you believe in. Even though you know you're taking real risks, physical risks, and financial risks, and to me that was the secret of the movement. I've talked to the former freedom riders a lot, and they have a kind of bittersweet memory of all this, because they were trying to effect a moral revolution, to somehow change a basically violent culture. And they were never able to do that. As late 60s, of course, interracial protest becomes difficult, and people become addicted to violence, particularly after the assassinations of 1968, and kind of give up on politics for a while. So in some ways they all felt a failure, except that they did win enough political leverage to get the Civil Rights Acts passed, and so they were more successful there. But that was never what they were after. They were really after the beloved community. That was the concept, which goes back to the World War I period. The great philosopher Josiah Royce came up with that term, and the Fellowship of Reconciliation used it for a year. Gandhi used it for a long time, but I don't know of anyone, except maybe James Lawson, who was one of Lewis's mentors, and King and John, put it at the center of their lives. There's never any wavering. There was an incident in 1965 when Dr. King was checking in to a hotel, a previously all-white hotel in Selma, and John's with him. It's January of 1965, before the march. This is just the beginning of the campaign, and this really rough, notorious white supremacist came up and started beating King up, punching him really hard, and hitting him in the head, and it was shocking. And John just reflexively reached out and grabbed the guy. Now, John was short, but he was strong. He was burly, kind of, and he held the guy until the police came, carted him away. But afterwards, he felt a little guilty because he had used force. It was as close as he ever came, I think, to violating his nonviolent principles. I mean, he took them so seriously. But I don't think he ever took himself that seriously. I mean, I think he knew who he was. He had a lot of self-knowledge, and he just, I saw him in so many situations where he could have strutted. You know, people are always telling him how wonderful he is. I don't think he ever listened to it. You know, I think he just somehow came to believe in this social gospel and the beloved community in a way that I think most of us can only dream of getting it that deep into our hearts and minds. And so I think that can be an empowering story. I sort of see these kinds of books in some ways as a continuation of the civil rights movement. I mean, I think the educational part of it now, look what happened in Black Lives Matter, which was the last thing, of course, that he saw before he died. He was so thrilled at this mass movement, even though it's been demonized now. But you know, the Black Lives Matter Plaza, which is Lafayette Square, right north of the White House, and he only had a week to live, and he somehow gathered his strength to walk out there with the mayor of Washington, and kind of raise his fist to make kind of a solidarity thing. And he died a week later. You know, he went to the hospital the next day for the last time. And but you know, with every ounce of his strength, he was committed to somehow getting us closer to the beloved community.
I think on that note, let's turn it over to the audience. I just asked that you, I believe a microphone is going to be passed around. Please do not speak until you get the microphone. Okay, and if you have a question, raise your hand and I can point to you. So who would like to start?
Thank you so much for the talk. You know, one thing that was fascinating to me is the context he came from, as you said, Pike County, Alabama. Coming from that context and embracing nonviolence, I'm from Pike County, Mississippi, where a lot of SNCC would go on work after Parchment, and a lot of the locals there were skeptical of nonviolence because that's not what helped them survive since Reconstruction. They viewed it as a tactic at times, a strategy that's somewhat wrong-headed, or maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. And so his inclination to embrace it in spite of the very dangerous context. Could you just speak to, do you feel like, maybe you could speak to, again, his process of embracing that.
Yeah.
Again, in Pike County, Mississippi at least, some people were willing to go along with it. Curtis Muhammad, Hollis Watkins, they were willing to go along with it for a while as a strategy, but maybe for its purposes.
Well, that's actually true of many people in the movement, and he knew that, and he knew a lot of people were skeptical, and he knew there was a certain utopian quality to what he was suggesting. He had people all around him who believed in armed self-defense, but he felt someone had to represent the other side. And of course, Dr. King did, although he had they all had learning curves. There's a famous story when Bayard Rustin went to Montgomery in early 1956, the early part of the bus boycott, which lasts a year, and he goes into King's house, and King excuses himself. He has to go into the kitchen, and then he sees the gun on the coffee table. And of course, Bayard Rustin wanted him to become the American Gandhi, and when King came back, he said, "You're never going to make it. You've got to get rid of the guns." Now, King had other people who were protecting him, but the symbolism here, I think, is really important. And for John, nonviolence was not a tactic or a strategy. It was a way of life. The same was true for Jim Lawson, his great mentor, who taught him in these nonviolent workshops in Nashville when he was a college student. But it's why he was thrown out of SNCC, because the center wouldn't hold anymore. I mean, he just didn't have enough support. But he would rather lose, be thrown out, than to break his principles, because at some point people are going to realize that, the way I would put it and the way he put it is, if you're going to reach the beloved community, you have to come to a point where you love your enemies as much as you love your friends. That's what he proved with Elwyn Wilson, right, on the Oprah show. That's an incredibly difficult thing to do. I've thought about this a lot over the last couple of years with the rise of Trumpism and what it has inspired in me, feelings of anger and maybe even hatred and desperation. But I always sort of return to what John Lewis would think about it, and he wouldn't be happy with me, but I haven't been able to always be able to control it. There was a really a telltale scene in 1968. John is working for the Robert Kennedy campaign in Indianapolis the night Dr. King is assassinated. And so John had gathered this big crowd in the inner city, Indianapolis, almost all black. And then Kennedy is the one who has to come and tell them that Dr. King has been killed. And probably the greatest speech that Bobby Kennedy ever gave in his life. Indianapolis that night was one of the very few major American cities that didn't go up in flames. And I think it was in part because of that speech. So John is very relieved that they're not going to seek vengeance or act out their anger in some unproductive way. And there was a very fine white Southern journalist, liberal, named Fred Powledge, who wrote some great works on civil rights. And he was there with John. He was there to interview him and to talk to Bobby Kennedy. And Fred just lost it. when he, everybody's crying, you know, and Fred says, you know, why is it always us who gets shot? Maybe we should just put a bullet in some of them or one of them, you know. And John just cuts him off at the knees. He says, I don't want to ever hear you say anything like that again. The world does not need more hate. And it's interesting because I think John was just in agony that night. He was so close to King, and it was just almost unthinkable that he had been assassinated, and yet he had the presence of mind to cut Fred Pallage off and say, I don't want to hear any of that notion of retaliatory violence. It's not going to get us anywhere. It's going to put us farther and farther back away from the beloved community. And I always thought that was kind of a telltale episode.
As we go to another question, can I also just get a quick time check so I know how much? You're good? Okay, great. So I guess we'll do maybe, I think, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Hi, thank you so much. I was privileged to meet him at one of Julian Bond's civil rights trips that were founded when Julian was a professor at UVA, and I'd gone to UVA, and it was
very
just
lucky. It was a great trip.
it was fantastic. You know, we went to Selma, we walked across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, all of it. My question is, how would he be a leader today? How would he help us with all the hate and all the violence and all the, how could he be effective today without being killed?
You're talking about John Lewis,
Yeah.
not Julian. Well, I think he would, with every ounce of his being, he would try to elect Kamala Harris as President of the United States. And he would try to, I think, keep people on a higher plane, to think about the long-term implications of what we're going through. And he'd be one of the ones really talking about the threat to American democracy, I think. And the fact that he died during the Trump administration, so I think he might feel a little more optimistic with during the Biden administration. And but you know, he was no Pollyanna. He knew what he was up against. Of course, you know, Trump swore vengeance on him when he started the boycott of Trump's first inauguration. Hopefully his only inauguration. I misspoke there. But you know, a lot of his congressional career, he was in the minority. Democrats were in the minority. And a lot of his best hopes were dashed. So he was, the one thing that struck me about him was how, in the face of anything, he was so optimistic. Even when he was dying of pancreatic cancer, the reporters would come to him and, how are you doing, John? He said, oh, I'm doing fine, I'm feeling great, you know. Of course, he was lying. He was not doing fine. But he always felt that people have to have the notion that you're in it for the long haul. It's a marathon, not a sprint. And that if you lose hope, that's the worst thing that can happen to you. So I think he would be really good for us right now. Not to take anything for granted, but you know, not to say that he's a miracle worker and he's going to, but he would be out there trying to rouse the electorate to that this is a moment which may not come again, and that the people have got to rally. And I think that's why he was so taken with the Black Lives Matter movement, that with George Floyd and all of that, because he once said, even though he was eloquent, he was a voracious reader, biography, history, even though he was so rough cut, you know, from Lehigh County, but he was a very smart guy. And he once said, I'm not a man of words, I'm a man of action. And he really meant that he was turning words into action. I think he would that's what he would be urging us to do, is to do everything we can possibly do, of course, nonviolently, but.
Hi there. First of all, thank you for coming. I really appreciate it.
That was my pleasure.
Next thing, so when you were talking, you kind of mentioned the fact that he was always an organizer on the ground, like that foot soldier role, but that he never really aspired to be in a leadership role. How can you speak to the fact about like how and why he went into that position and how he, got into a spot of leadership from an organizing spot?
Well, it was sort of thrust upon him in 1963. The head of SNCC decided he'd had enough, and he resigned unexpectedly. He'd been having trouble with the fundraising parts of it, and that had taken over the job, and he just didn't feel that he could do a good job anymore. And they basically picked John. He didn't run or anything like that. They said, "You're the man," and this is just a few weeks before the March on Washington. That's how he becomes one of the big six, and is thrust into this role. But I think he handled it. I mean, I think he really thought a lot about leadership, what real, true leadership is, even though he wasn't thrilled at being thrust at 23 years old into this role. And of course, for him, true leadership was being true to your principles. And he just didn't like cutting corners at all. There's an example of this when he was spent 6 years on the Atlanta City Council when Andy Young, his friend, was mayor. But Andy Young was quite a politician, and he cut some corners, I can tell you. And they were building the roads to the Jimmy Carter Center. And a lot of people, poor people in the black community were really upset that they were going right through the most traditional black neighborhood in Atlanta. And everybody else on the city council went along with it. And they brought incredible pressure on John to change his vote. He got calls from the entire Kennedy family. It was just incredible what they did, and he would not budge. And in some ways, it ruined his career on the city council because they never made him a committee chair. They froze him out. But he was able. Basically, it was a graft thing where all the politicians were getting money from this construction company that was going to. And it was a black construction company, So John got a lot of heat. Aren't you helping, your buddies? But one thing I say in the book is that John was never really a race man. He's very proud of being an African American, but he was more into human rights than civil rights per se, and he had this broad progressive agenda. He was one of the very first people who spoke out for gay rights in the black community. That was tough in those years, and same-sex marriage and environmental concerns. All across the thing. He was not, a one-note person. And the irony of the story I was just telling you is that the road that goes to the Carter Center, maybe some of you have been there, is now the John Lewis Highway. So he didn't like that, but so you win some, you lose some, I guess.
Great talk.
Thank you.
Did he ever Kwame Ture? Did they ever make up years later, after when Kwame Ture became president of SNCC on that vote? Did the two ever make up later?
You mean with Julian?
John Lewis and Kwame Ture. Still
Oh.
Carmichael.
They had an interesting relationship. Stokely was, for the people who knew him, was a very likable guy. He was funny, clever, always had something to say. In some ways, very different than John Lewis, but John saw the talent and appreciated it. But Stokely Carmichael did a couple of things I think that John found unforgivable. In fact, one of the things was that John overheard this conversation between Stokely and one of his close friends about essentially framing Dr. King of setting up a situation, because John was the only SNCC leader who retained ties to King. He was on the board of directors of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. It was very controversial within SNCC because during the Freedom Rides they wanted him to become a Freedom Rider, King, and he wouldn't do it. I think he would have done it if he were making a decision himself, but his aides said, "Look, you're crazy. You're likely to get killed if you go on the Freedom Ride to Mississippi. We need you to raise money, to speak. We don't need you to be another Freedom Rider. We got 436 Freedom Riders, But the SNCC kids didn't see it that way. They thought, they started talking about him, they called him the Lord, that he was sort of comparing him. He made a statement, he seemed to be comparing himself to Jesus, and they were really turned off by that. And a lot of them never forgave him. And so the breach between SNCC and SCLC got wider and wider. But John desperately fought it. Eventually he couldn't because they threw him out of SNCC, and it really hurt him deeply. It's interesting that Stokely only lasted a year. He was sort of thrown over like the second part of the revolution, and it was a pretty unseemly way that they ousted John. I mean, in some ways it was almost inevitable because he had lost support among so many people who were, his explanation was that there were more and more northern blacks coming in who didn't have the same sensibility as the people who really had started SNCC in 1960. I'm not sure how true that is, but he felt that they just, there were people who were not quite with the spirit of nonviolence and interracial cooperation, and he felt that once SNCC lost that, its emphasis on interracial, there were a lot of really powerful, brave white people who were involved in the movement. They were all thrown out after John left, and then SNCC collapsed. By '67, it's essentially gone, and so I don't know that you can blame Stokely Carmichael for that, but whatever things he thought he could do, he ended up not being able to do it. And of course, he left the country and died in Africa. And people like H. Rap Brown and others sort of replaced him, who were even more radical in many respects. And but I think he admired him in a general sense. I mean, he just didn't like the way he manipulated politics within SNCC. I think that was the thing. It was the division.
I think that as our time is drawing to a close, I just want to also, I guess as a moderator, I get to have a little bit of a final word, which is that there is a quote from towards the end of the book that I think will stay with me, and I look forward to assigning this book, and perhaps that could be of some use to students and to people out there who go, what do we do in this moment in the future? And it's something Lewis wrote towards the end of his life, which is, our struggle is not the struggle of a day, a month, or a year. It's the struggle of a lifetime. And I want to say thank you for not only including that, but opening up potentially John Lewis's life to a new generation of people who might kind of carry forward that search for the beloved community. So I want to thank you, Dr. Arsenault, for your time. Thank you. And then I think that we're going to transition into